Hi, this is Elliot from EO Nutrition, and this video is going to be the first in a series of videos that I'm doing on the concept of plant toxins. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because many people believe plants to be safe and healthy, and whilst this may be the case for certain individuals, there are many other people who actually find that they cannot tolerate certain plants. Just so the listeners understand, plants have developed a very complex set of inbuilt defense mechanisms throughout their evolution. And whilst animals can run away with their legs, plants can't. And so the way that they do this is they release certain biochemical or chemical mediators, which essentially prevent herbivores from consuming them. Now, whilst some people can tolerate these poisons, essentially, other people cannot. And really it depends on the individual as to whether these biochemical compounds can cause significant damage or not. So the first video that I'm going to be doing today is on the concept of oxalate. For the audience who don't know what oxalate is, we'll cover the basics. And when we're talking about oxalate, it's important to understand that oxalate is actually composed of two different things. One is an organic acid called oxalic acid. So this is a significantly corrosive organic acid. And you can think of it a bit like a magnet, whereby it actually has a very high affinity for certain minerals, and it draws them close to it and it can bind with them. So two of those minerals are potassium and sodium. And when it binds with potassium and sodium, it can form a soluble oxalate salt. So oxalate is actually referring to the binding of the mineral and the oxalic acid. Likewise, oxalic acid can also bind with another mineral called calcium, and it has a particularly high affinity for calcium. When it binds with calcium, it forms an insoluble calcium salt. Okay, an insoluble calcium oxalate. Oxalate is ubiquitous among the plant kingdom. In fact, it's found in many different kinds of plants. And as a general rule, it's found in very low amounts in animal foods. Oxalate is also produced in very small amounts as part of normal human metabolism. But we're going to go into that in the next video because there are some things to consider there. And there are some conditions which actually might predispose someone to producing more oxalates. As I said, oxalates are found in most plants. However, in certain plants they are much higher than in others. For example, oxalate is extraordinarily high in rhubarb, in spinach, in almonds, in many of the foods actually which become a staple part of things like the Paleolithic diet or the ketogenic diet. When we remove things like grains from our diet, we often try to substitute them with other things like nut flours or so-called healthy grains. And unfortunately, many of these actually contain really high levels of oxalate. If you look to the side, you can see amaranth, which is a typical gluten-free baking flour, is also really high. Much like if people use almond flour, they are going to potentially expose themselves to much higher levels of oxalate. Many of the green vegetables contain very high levels of oxalate as well. People who follow Paleolithic or ketogenic diets tend to eat these foods at a much higher quantity than the average person. Likewise, what we have to consider here is that many of the foods which contain high oxalates are typically seasonal. As you can see, oxalates are found in many different foods, but at the same time, there are also some foods which are relatively low in oxalate. So we can't pair leafy greens all into the same camp because there are certain other leafy greens which really contain negligible amounts. If we look at the structure of the oxalate crystal, this is where it really gets interesting. Under a microscope, oxalate is actually, it boasts quite an intimidating structure. In fact, it can exist as various different spiky and crystal formations, and its physical qualities endow it with the ability to cause significant physical stress on surrounding tissues. So as you can see to the side, you have spiky formations and weird fork-like structures. It's because of these structural qualities that researchers have actually proposed that oxalate is one of these plant defense mechanisms, and when consumed in high amounts can potentially cause problems. Now that we've established where we get oxalate from in the diet, it's important to look at the factors which can influence how much we absorb. So in plants, oxalate can exist as oxalic acid or as a mineral oxalate, so potassium oxalate or calcium oxalate. And when it gets into the gut, we can only absorb the soluble forms, such as potassium and sodium oxalate, and the oxalic acid, which is free. We cannot absorb insoluble oxalate, such as calcium oxalate. So when oxalate containing foods reach the gut, because of oxalic acid's high affinity for calcium, what this means is that dietary calcium is actually bound up with the oxalate and it prevents the absorption. This is somewhat protective. Unfortunately though, what it actually means is that the dietary calcium is also not absorbed. So foods which are high in oxalate and simultaneously high in calcium probably means that the calcium is not very bioavailable. One food comes into mind right here, and this is spinach, because this is something that is purported to have a very high calcium content. But when we consider that it's also very high in oxalate, the chances are calcium absorption from spinach is going to be fairly low. Calcium bound up with oxalate prevents its absorption, and this is a good thing. But there's also several other factors which determine how much oxalate we absorb. One of those is the gut bacteria. So certain types of gut bacteria, including Oxalobacter, Eubacterium, Lactobacillus, and these are among others as well. These bacteria are actually responsible for degrading oxalate in the gut. Once they degrade oxalate, this means that we're not going to absorb oxalate, and this is another good thing. So having enough of these bacteria is actually very protective. Now, unfortunately, there are certain types of antibiotics which have been shown to kill off these bacteria. One of those belongs to the family of fluoroquinolone antibiotics. You may have heard of ciprofloxacin or levofloxacin. There are many others, but this is one that comes to mind. Now, these antibiotics kill off the bacteria, and when you don't have as much bacteria, what this means is that you're more likely to absorb more oxalate into the blood. There is something else as well. So, fat digestion plays a key role in this. If there's a problem digesting fats, then unemulsified fatty acids, which make their way through the gut, actually also have a high affinity for calcium. When they bind up with calcium, this renders less calcium to bind up with oxalate. This basically means that there's more oxalate to get into the bloodstream because it's unbound. Intestinal permeability or leaky gut is also going to increase the amount of oxalate that's absorbed. Research supports this, and it shows that when there is something like celiac disease or even just intestinal permeability, this does significantly increase the rate of oxalate absorbed. The primary route of oxalate absorption is basically through the mouth, into the gut, into the bloodstream, down into the kidneys, and when it reaches the kidneys, it's secreted or it's excreted into the urine. This is the ordinary route by which we get rid of oxalates from the body. The problem is that when there's too many oxalates, okay? When there is too many oxalates, this is medically referred to as Hyperoxuria. Now, this condition exists in two forms. The first form is called primary hyperoxaluria, and this is basically characterized by an enzyme or a inherited defect in an enzyme which is involved in something called the glyoxalate pathway. And this is the pathway whereby people can endogenously produce their own oxalate. So when people have this kind of condition or this inherited genetic defect, it causes their body to produce too much endogenous oxalate, and this can cause several problems, as we will see later on. The other form is called secondary hyperoxaluria, and this is generally characterized by a non-genetic predisposition. So this can be caused by celiac disease, it can be caused by dysbiosis, it can be caused by intake of certain compounds or substances which have been shown to act as precursors for oxalate, such as ethylene glycol, such as glycine or ascorbate. But furthermore, another risk factor for secondary hyperoxaluria is simply a high oxalate diet. In fact, a high oxalate diet is probably going to be a main factor involved for many people who suffer with high oxalates. Remember that I said that there are certain types of bacteria which degrade oxalate. Well, it's been shown that when there is a high oxalate diet, when you feed these bacteria with too many oxalates, then this actually kills off the bacteria. It inhibits the bacteria to such an extent that they start to die and they can no longer do the job of degrading oxalate. In the case of a very high oxalate burden in the body, oxalate in the blood has actually been found to deposit in various tissues. The most well-known and well-studied of these is kidney stones. Roughly 80% of kidney stone cases are characterized by calcium oxalate crystals. This is really where a lot of the research is focused on when looking at oxalates. But actually, oxalate has been found to deposit in far-reaching places. It has been found to deposit in the brain. It can deposit in the eyes, in the muscles, in the joints. When it deposits in the joints, in the synovial fluid, this can actually cause symptoms which mimic arthritis. They cause significant pain and inflammation and discomfort. It can also deposit in the teeth and in the bones and in the skin. It seems like oxalate can get into every nook and cranny in the body and cause havoc. So, as I've said, if you think back to the physical structure of the oxalate crystal, we see that it's spiky and that it can cause significant stress to the surrounding physical tissue. This is mechanical damage it's causing. However, oxalate can actually get inside the cell. Research has shown that micron and nano-sized crystals pass through the cell membrane, and when they get inside the cell, they can cause significant disruptions to the intracellular biochemistry. These very small crystals can disrupt many different enzymes inside the cell. One of these is called pyruvate kinase. Pyruvate kinase is involved in a process called glycolysis, and this is really the first step by which our body takes carbohydrates and breaks them down for energy. It's expected that if pyruvate kinase is inhibited, then this could disrupt our ability to metabolize carbohydrates. Oxalate has also been shown to essentially block the activity of carboxylase enzymes, which are known to be biotin dependent. One of these is transcarboxylase, which takes methylmalonyl-CoA and pyruvate and converts them into propionlyl-CoA and oxaloacetate. Furthermore, another enzyme is called pyruvate carboxylase. Pyruvate carboxylase takes pyruvate and converts it into oxaloacetate. Now, not only is this step important for fatty acid metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism, it's also a key step in gluconeogenesis, which is part of amino acid metabolism. It's essentially how we convert various amino acids to be used for energy. Oxalate can also affect various other aspects of the cell. It's been shown to have an effect on the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is essentially made up of phospholipids, and as part of that there is something called phosphatidylserine. So oxalate has been shown to have an effect on phosphatidylserine, whereby it can dislocate or dislodge from the membrane and actually detach from the cell, and this is expected to disrupt the integrity of the cell membrane. In addition to that, oxalate has also been found to rupture other organelles called lysosomes. Lysosomes are basically the part of the cell which is responsible for breaking down old degraded material and pathogenic material. It does this by using things called hydrolytic enzymes, which are really quite volatile, and it's important that they stay within the protective barrier of the lysosome. Well, when oxalate ruptures the lysosome, what happens is hydrolytic enzymes actually leak out from the lysosome and start destroying various other aspects of the cell. In the mitochondria, oxalate has been shown to reduce oxygen consumption and reserve capacity. It reduces the mitochondrial membrane potential and inhibits the mitochondria's ability to make energy. This is not a good thing, because everything that your cell needs to do to stay healthy requires energy in the form of ATP. When you disrupt that process, you're potentially going to cause problems down the line. Nano and micron-sized oxalate crystals can also destroy the DNA and damage the nucleus, which is essentially the house of the DNA inside the cell. It can cause mutations to the DNA and affect how DNA is transcribed. To top it all off, oxalate has actually been found to induce cell death. This can happen via multiple different mechanisms. The two main mechanisms, one is referred to as apoptosis and another one is necrosis. Oxalate can actually poke holes in the cell membrane and cause extracellular fluid to flow into the cell, causing the cell to burst. Furthermore, the latter mechanism essentially involves shrinkage of the cell, causing it to die. There is also something called the inflammasome, and this is basically a multi-component piece of machinery inside the cell made up of various proteins. It's involved in immune activation and immune regulation, and researchers have proposed that this is essentially involved in chronic inflammation and has been implicated in many different chronic health issues. It's clear that when oxalate gets too high, it can cause both extracellular macroscopic changes in tissues, but it can also completely derail what's going on inside the cell. And therefore, it's not really something that the human body can effectively deal with. In fact, oxalate can't really be metabolized per se. It's not something that we can do much with. We really have to just get it out of the body. Oxalate poses a significant threat to human health, especially if someone is predisposed to absorbing too much of it. We've said that there are many things which predispose one to too many oxalates, and I think that the point that really needs to be stressed here is that many dietary models focus on foods which are very high in oxalate. This can be seen with the recent popular upsurge of green smoothies. If you're the kind of person who is consuming green smoothies on a daily basis, it might really be something that you might want to reconsider. This is because the effects of oxalates can go unnoticed for a very long time, and they can be quite insidious. The green smoothies far surpass the daily recommended intake of oxalate and can really act as an unnecessary burden when taken on a daily basis. I would not recommend consuming green smoothies because I think that they're overrated. If you are really set on consuming green smoothies, I definitely wouldn't use spinach. I would try to opt for some low oxalate vegetables instead. There are many different kinds of nutrients which are somewhat protective against oxalate. One of those is called citrate, and citrate is essentially capable of breaking down oxalate crystals. It's therefore very useful in cases of kidney stones or in cases of urinary tract infections, where it helps to effectively alkalize the urine and also potentially break down oxalate crystals so that they can be passed through the urine. Aside from that, calcium is also very important because if you do consume oxalate containing foods, you want to try to aim for enough calcium so that you could bind that up inside the gut. So oxalate toxicity can effectively manifest in many different symptoms. It can manifest as joint pain. It can manifest as kidney stones, as chronic urinary tract infections, as skin disruptions, as brain fog. In fact, I think oxalate toxicity can manifest in practically any kind of symptom. For more information on oxalates, I highly recommend the readers and the listeners to look at the work of Susan Owens, who is really a world expert in this field. She also runs a website called Low Oxalate Info, and she runs a Facebook group called Trying Low Oxalates. In the next video, I'm going to be going into how the human body can actually synthesize oxalates itself, and how under certain conditions, such as vitamin deficiencies, oxalate synthesis can actually increase, and this can be problematic. So if you like this video or you found it helpful, please subscribe to EO Nutrition. You can find me on YouTube or on Facebook, and I will be producing more content like this in the near future. This is Elliot from EO Nutrition. Thank you for watching and see you soon.